All right. Welcome to another outdoor wilderness adventure episode of the Bookly podcast. I'm really hoping that I last longer than 5 minutes doing this episode. I am getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. This episode I'm recording at my sister's house because we're out here staying and she lives in the middle of nowhere and I'm kind of like sequestered a little bit in the woods. For a couple of reasons. One, there's just kiddos running around literally everywhere. My sister has a whole gaggle of children, and then plus my two. And then on top of that, there's a creek, a stream. I don't know what it is. There's a body of water that runs directly next to my sister's house, which is absolutely gorgeous in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. However, it makes it really loud. So I can't just be like outside the house, and I also or on the porch like I was at my parents' house. And I also can't really be inside. So we're just going to rock it here and see how this turns out. And we're going to see, how long this episode is. I honestly don't have a whole lot to talk about with this book. So this may end up being the shortest episode of the Bookly podcast to date. I also think everybody is waiting on me to go on a hike. And I'm kind of holding things up because we're a couple days late on this episode. Took me a little bit longer to read this book. And obviously just on vacation. So trying not to stress out about it and just do the podcast at my own leisure for my own fun. But we'll see how this ends up going. Some of the feedback that I've been getting for the podcast was that I need to be a little bit more personal. And people, enjoy stories and learning about me and connecting with me as the host of the podcast. And so I did want to tell one story that happened really funny this week. Mostly it has absolutely nothing to do with this book. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just a really funny story about my kids. And I wanted to share it because everybody who I've shared it with gets a really good kick out of it. So if you know our oldest, she is turning, she's a little over 3.5. She'll be 4 in September. She is way too smart for her own good, and she has a personality and a half. The other day, she's, learning about bodily functions and all that kind of stuff, and she's going to the bathroom, and she looks down while going to the bathroom and goes, "Mom, is this poop diarrhea or not diarrhea?" And so my wife looks in the toilet and she goes, "Oh, it's not diarrhea." And my 3-year-old looks right at her and goes, "Ew, Mom, stop talking about poop. That's disgusting." And it's so funny because if you know her, you know that she did that on purpose to just troll my wife, which is hilarious. But yeah, that's basically my life right now. A mildly aggressively sarcastic 3-year-old who is way too smart for her own good, and a almost walking 1-year-old that is a handful and a half to keep up with on a vacation to Alaska. So that being said, my trip here has not given me nearly enough time, or nearly as much time as I would have expected to read. So I'm a little bit behind on my reading goals, but I did finish this week's book, which was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And like I said on last week's episode of the podcast, I had no idea what this book was about. I thought it was about a tree, obviously because of the title. But I had no idea that this was like a coming-of-age story. And so I'll go ahead and read the description for all of those who are just like me and have absolutely no idea what this book is about. And then we'll start diving into my thoughts and just overall impressions from this book. Again, I think we're going to keep this episode nice, short, and sweet, mostly because everybody inside is waiting on me to go on a hike. But here is the description of this book. The beloved American classic about a young girl's coming of age as the turn of the century, Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a poignant, oh my gosh, these mosquitoes. A poignant and moving tale filled with compassion and cruelty, laughter and heartache, crowded with the life of people and incident. The story of a young, sensitive, idealistic Francie Nolan and her bittersweet formative years in the slums of Williamsburg has enchanted and inspired millions of readers for more than 60 years. By turns overwhelming, sublime, heartbreaking, and uplifting, the daily experiences of the unforgettable Nolans are raw with honesty and tenderness, threaded with family connectedness. Connectedness, that's an interesting word. In a work of literary art that brilliantly captures a unique time and place, as well as incredibly rich moments of universal experience. Holy freaking crap. I'm getting eaten alive over here. But yes, this book is a coming-of-age story about a young girl who is absurdly poor in Williamsburg, New York, in Brooklyn, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do this episode. And it is a slow burner. So for anybody who has not read this book, just know that this is not a book that is driven by plot, is what I would say. It's driven by character development. The entire book follows, essentially the Nolan family, but primarily Francie Nolan. It's told from the perspective of Francie Nolan. And it is a book that, again, because it's character driven and not plot driven, I feel like there are moments when she's not developing or when she is kind of stagnant or like doesn't understand what's going on in the world around her that make the book drag a little bit. Like there were definitely moments of this book where I like almost dreaded listening to it, but I knew I had to record a podcast episode. And then there were moments of this book that I felt like were absolutely beautiful. There were moments that I felt like were kind of like it says in the description of the book, kind of like universal truths, people like discovering things about, it was Francie Nolan discovering things about herself, discovering things about the people around her, discovering things about her parents, there were just a lot of things that were really relatable in this book, as well as also giving you perspective on things that I have absolutely no experience with, being... There's, portions of this book that deal with being extraordinarily impoverished. There are portions of this book that deal with kind of like not being the favorite child, which growing up, I was always the favorite child in our family. So it wasn't super relatable that way, but I was talking to my sister and she said that portion of the book was relatable for her. So I could see how for some people who aren't the favorite, this may be a little bit more relatable. But yeah, there were absolutely beautiful moments in this book, and also moments that made you like really feel for the characters. They go through addiction, heartbreak, misunderstandings, and it is truly beautiful to watch this young girl, go through these events in her life and rise to the occasion. I think is really what it makes this book so inspiring. It's a very unassuming main character I wouldn't say that over accomplishes, but accomplishes just enough to give you hope. Because that's one of my pet peeves with some coming of age stories and some stories is, you get, it's kind of like last week's episode was on, I think it was on Mistborn, but it's kind of the standard trope, like you have a character who struggles and then eventually becomes the best at whatever they're doing, or overcomes and has some enormous success. But in this book, it's not really, there is no enormous success or payoff in the end. It's somebody who struggles pretty quietly, struggles with everything from her self-image, her family's image, struggles with dealing with relationships in her life that, have failed her, feeling inadequate, and really the success is at the end that she kind of rises above that and finds out who she really is. And so there's not any major payoff at the end of the book. She doesn't become, at the very beginning of the book, it talks about her love for reading and her desire to become a writer. And so I kind of felt like the book was kind of leading towards this climax in which she would get something very notable published or, like achieve her dream. And really none of that, doesn't really come to pass like that. Like that's not the conclusion of the book. The conclusion of the book is more of her finding her own identity throughout her trials. And like I said, it's definitely more of a quiet beauty, this book. So I understand why it's considered a classic. I understand why people relate to it so well. I also understand why in the reviews for this book, there are a lot of 3 and 4 star reviews. So typically with a lot of like classic books, I would say in Goodreads and in, kind of like Amazon reviews and things like that, you see a lot of 5-star reviews, and then you see a lot of 1-star and 2-star reviews that kind of balance it out to be like a 4.5 or something like that. This book had a lot of 3 and 4 star reviews. And I kind of understand why, because there are portions of the book that I would say were kind of like 2-star worthy. There were portions of the book that I felt like were definitely 5-star worthy. It's a long book. It's 500 pages, and there are moments, like I said, that drag a little bit, but overall, really, really, I don't know. I wouldn't say I really, really loved it, but overall, really appreciative of the fact that I read it. I think it's a book that deserves to be read, deserves to be, put into the lists of, great books. When choosing this book, I did a lot of searches this year for 100 books that everybody should read before they die. And this book was in there almost every single time. Oh my heck, dude, these mosquitoes, I'm going to be just eaten alive. All right, this episode is going to be like half an hour long. This is ridiculous. But yeah, there are a lot of episodes, or a lot of lists of the podcast. Holy cow, I can't even think because of the mosquitoes. Gee whiz, this is getting rough. So, no, there are a lot of book lists that rank this in the top 100 books that everybody should read before they die. A lot of times this is ranked in the top 30 or top 50 even. It's a very highly regarded book. And so that was the primary reason why I chose this book. I was like, well, if everybody should read it before they die, I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot. I don't know that I would put this. I just don't really know. I would love to talk to somebody who absolutely loved this book, because I was talking with Olivia, my wife, and I was talking with Leanne, who's also been on the podcast, my sister, who we're staying with right now. And both of them liked this book. Both of them were like, I'm glad that I had read it. There were things that were relatable. But ultimately, both of them were not super memorable, and also neither of them gave it a 5-star book. So for me, that's a little bit interesting because, both of them read an absurd amount. My wife reads 100+ books a year. Leanne reads, 50+ books a year. They're pretty avid readers. I would say they've read for years. But neither of them gave this book a 5-star review. And I get that it's all subjective, but it's always interesting to me, what classifies a book as the top 100 books that everyone should read before they die. And is it necessarily that every single book on that list has to be a 5-star review? Or is it that it covers a topic that everybody needs to experience in even just a small capacity? And so I think that may be why, kind of doing some reflection about this book, I don't think that it was an overly engaging book. I don't think that it was a book that I'm going to internalize and it's going to be life-changing. I don't think it was, a story that made me want to, return back to it over and over and over again. But I do think it covers a topic that everybody needs to develop at least a small portion of empathy towards. And I think that that's what makes this book a top 100 book of all time, or a top 100 book that everybody must read before they die, because it does cover a topic that I feel like if you were ever going to really, really try to gain empathy for anybody, I think the group of people that you should really try to do that for is the people who are just born into poverty, surrounded by poverty, and have no way of getting out of it because they're constantly working to make it through that week, to make it through that day, to make it through that month. And there's no opportunity for them to really rise above that, because if they stop focusing on eating food that day, having shelter that day, then they won't make it. And I think that that's a reality for people. And I think that as Americans and around the world, we have become pretty blessed, that fewer and fewer people find themselves in that sort of reality, but it's a reality that existed since the beginning of time, and it's a reality that still exists now. There are people who, it's not a matter of just picking yourself up by your bootstraps, working hard, and becoming successful. There are people who literally don't have time to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, because if they stop doing what they're doing now, they're done. And that was one of the things of this book that you start to realize of, kind of the potential of Francie Nolan, the potential of the Nolan family, the potential of a lot of the people within the Nolan family, and the situation that these kids find themselves in, and that, they can't keep up with their peers. They're not given the opportunity to go to high school. They're not given the opportunity to kind of laugh and have fun and go to the movies like a lot of the other kids around them are doing, because they have to work. They have to provide for their family. They have to, put food on the table. They have to, kind of do the things that normal kids really shouldn't have to do. And again, it's a make-believe story. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is not a true story, but that doesn't remove kind of the emotional connection that you can develop from a story like this. And like I said, it's a group of people that need our empathy, need our understanding, need to kind of be seen in order to look for ways to help lift people out of this kind of extreme situation, this extreme poverty, and, provide people with equal opportunity. I think that that's one of the greatest things about this country is the opportunity to do great things. And although, yes, they're, legally everybody has equal opportunity, situationally that doesn't exist. And that's not something that I always believed in. I, for a long time, and you can ask my wife and you can ask my friends, I've always been a pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy. I've always been a, no matter how hard it is, anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. And I'm slowly starting to realize that the ability or the freedom to do that is always there. The circumstance to do that does not always exist. And so I think that that's kind of the next big battle in kind of providing equality. And I know that word equality is thrown around a lot. And I don't know, I hate that word equality because I feel like there's been a movement to move equality to equal outcome regardless of input. And, you've got this idea that equality really means equity and that everybody should have the same thing, regardless of where you start off, everybody should end in the same spot. And I don't necessarily think that's true, because no matter where you start, there's a different level of input that goes into it. Some people work harder than others, and that's just a fact. And I don't think that we should ever reward hard workers less. This country was built on the backs of people who work hard and who are rewarded for working hard. And it's an incentive structure that's as old as time. And if you remove that incentive structure, history has basically shown us that it's not a good recipe for success. However, I think there is something to be said about creating an equality of not just ability, not just like possibilities, but of circumstances is the way that I would put it, of circumstances, because the Nolan family in this book was not in a place in their life in which they could take advantage of the American dream. They were living day to day. They were rationing food. They were making sure that they had, 10 cents enough to work so that they could buy clothes so that they could go to work. It's a completely different lifestyle than somebody who's, working their 9 to 5 and has the ability to, put in some extra hours after work and start their own business and slowly grow that and become successful through maybe, working above and beyond a standard 40-hour work week. No, the Nolans were doing that and more just to survive. And so, again, I just think it gave me, I don't think it gave me, I think this is something that I've been building upon for a while through reading, but it definitely reiterated in a very strong way kind of the need for us to continue to examine where we're at as a country, where we're at as, individuals, and how we can look around and help those who maybe can't take advantage of the incredible opportunity that we're given living here in the United States because of the circumstances in which they live. Because that, to me, is equality. Equality exists when everybody has access to it and everybody has an opportunity to take advantage of it. And right now, I think everybody has access to the American dream, but I don't think everybody has an equal opportunity to take advantage of it. Now, the outcome is completely different. The outcome is always going to be dependent upon your input and your actions. And I think that that's also important. I don't think we can reward people based on, a lack of output. And I don't think we should penalize people who, try to become overachievers. However, like I said, I think that, this book really goes to show that you can have extraordinary individuals who just don't have an opportunity to take advantage of the American dream because of their circumstances. And that it makes you empathize with those situations, and it makes you really think about, the blessings in your life, gives you a little bit of perspective. I mean, I do think that this book really, really made me think. And I mean, what more could you want from a great book than to make you really think and think about the many blessings in your life? Now, that was kind of my overall opinion of this book. Some other thoughts while reading it, though, was I did love Francie Nolan as a character. This book was definitely not plot-driven. There's not a whole lot that goes on as far as, the overall. I mean, I think this is like a 500-page book. Oh, my gosh. I am getting eaten alive here, by the way. So for anybody for the 50 people who listen or watch my podcast, just know I am literally sacrificing blood, sweat, and everything else for you podcast listeners, trying to inspire more people to read good books and, just bring people together through reading and get to know me, because I'm a pretty awesome guy. No, but I digress. No, I mean, this book is 500-ish pages long, from what I understand. On Audible, it's like 15 hours long. And you could probably count on two hands the things that happen in this book. There are not a lot of events that take place that are, of major importance. The purpose of this book and the way that it's actually classified is it's a coming of age story. There's actually a German word for it, and it's called Bildungsraum. And that is what this book technically was classified when it came out, because this is an older book. And it is that Bildungsraum is a German word, and it is a literary genre that focuses on psychological and moral growth of the protagonist from childhood to adulthood. It is literally a coming-of-age story, and that is what this book is. So, what you can expect from this book is a extraordinary main character, which is Francie Nolan. And like I said, she comes from a family with a father who's an alcoholic, a mother who's amazing, but a little bit distant. She has a brother who is both of her parents' favorite child, or who I don't know if both the parents. I think it's just her mother, who's her mother's favorite child, and she struggles with that. She struggles with kind of this lack of love in her life. Her father dies at an early age, and again, she it's more of these kind of relatable factors in a very deep and rich character. So if you, again, it just more opportunities to develop empathy, to learn, to grow with characters that either maybe you can't relate with, maybe you're like me and you were always your parents' favorite child, or maybe you're my sister and you were not your parents' favorite child. I hate to break it to you, Leanne, but either way, you can either relate or empathize with these characters in a way that is sometimes hard to do with real people in your life. I think that that's one of the magical things about books. One of the things that I'm slowly starting to really love about reading is it's sometimes hard to, it's sometimes hard to empathize or relate to real people, which I know is sad. But it's easier to do in a book. And I'm really hoping that over time, that empathy, that relatability will transfer from books to people, and it will become easier and easier to empathize and relate to individuals. And I think it does. I think some of the best people that I know in my life are, big readers, and they've developed a lot of their personality from the things that they've learned from books, and not just things that they've learned, historical facts. They're not just spitting out facts or spitting out quotes from books, but the emotional intelligence that's developed through reading as well. I think that that's increasingly overlooked through reading, and I think we substitute a lot of that emotional intelligence or a lot of that reading and story-based learning. We've substituted books for movies, and not that I'm trying to dig on movies. I'm a huge movie fan. I'm a huge TV show fan. I've watched a lot. I originally thought about making a whole separate podcast about books and movies because I freaking love books and movies. And anybody knows me knows that I do watch probably too much television. But, and there was a large portion of my life where that is how I digested stories. But there's something deeper that's developed the longer you spend with characters, and the more in a kind of a more intimate form, which I feel like is reading, because it gives you the ability to imagine, to fill in the gaps with your own experiences, because everything's not laid out in front of you. You can't just see it all. You have to use your imagination. You have to fill it in yourself. And because of that, reading becomes a much more intimate experience with the story. And I think it lends itself to be a little bit more of a developmental process. Now, there are some books, that are just being, that are made purely for entertainment, and that's awesome. And there are some movies that I will say have a very emotional purpose and have the ability to connect really emotionally. But I would say, just like everything, there's not, sorry about that. It's not black and white. It's definitely a spectrum, but I would say that, on average, books and literature tend to lend themselves to be more of an emotional connection. And so, if you don't read, start reading. Come on. If you've listened to this podcast at all by now, and I haven't convinced you to start reading, then I'm doing a terrible job, because I was not a reader. I was an idiot. I mean, I still am an idiot. Not that reading's made that any different. But I didn't read at all, and I hated reading. I made fun of people that read all the time. I was like, oh, you read? What a nerd. And I look back on all those years, and you don't have to read a book a week, and you don't even have to read a book a month. But if you just start somewhere and start learning to love reading, learning to learn and grow and develop emotionally, and and psychologically, and grow your intelligence, whatever it is, through reading. I think that's a lifelong journey that will only make you a better person. And this book is one of those books that, although is not incredibly page turning, it was not terribly engaging, and overall, I would rank it a 3.5. I do think I would still, even with a 3.5, say that this is one of those books that everybody should read before they die, which is crazy to me. It's crazy because I never quite understood why a 3.5 book would be ranked in that need to read before you die, but it's mostly because of the emotional connection that's developed in a story like this, and a beautiful story like this, a story that's incredibly well written, easy to digest, a very relatable character. I think that it's important. I think that it is very, very important. So again, I'm going to just go ahead and say that on the overall ranking, this is a 5 for importance for me, and a 3.5 for engaging. Actually, a 3 for engaging. 3 for engaging, 5 for importance. Overall, 3.5. And I will add a little asterisk here to this episode of the podcast. I am on vacation, and I'm in Alaska, and I don't think, as my wife would call this, I don't think that this is a beach read book. I don't think that this is a book that you crack open while you're on vacation. You just need something light. You need a story. You're kind of more plot-driven book, something that's a little bit more of a page-turner to catch your attention, to keep you up at night while you're exhausted from hiking and fishing and everything else that we're doing here in Alaska. This is not that book. So I think had I read this book at home, kind of in my normal routine, I probably would have given this book a 4. I'll be completely honest. However, with it not being majorly plot driven, it was a little bit difficult to get through at moments, and I just couldn't get into it. And so if I had to give any advice on this book, it would be, don't read this book on vacation. This is not a beach read. This is a in your routine, reading this book because it's an important book read. And I think you'll get much more out of it. And I think you will enjoy this book a lot more. Just wanted to go ahead and add that. So I have lost a cool pint of blood at this point. I'm going to shrivel up into nothingness. And I know that most episodes of the Bookly podcast are they usually rank somewhere between like 50 minutes to an hour. But this episode of the podcast, we're going to cut it short, mostly because I don't have a whole lot more to say about this book. I don't have any like deep insights into it, so I don't want to just keep rambling. I did really enjoy it. That's all I want to say. I don't have a whole lot of facts about the author. You can look her up on Betty something on Wikipedia. There's not a whole lot about her. She's written a couple other books. So I really don't have a whole lot more to share. And at the same time, everybody's waiting on me, and I'm getting absolutely destroyed by mosquitoes. So, update on the Bookly podcast, though, before I head out. We are like 3 days late on this episode of the podcast. This will be uploaded Friday evening, mostly because my parents' internet, I think my dad said it was run by like a hamster on a wheel is what he was saying. For anybody who understands internet, my dad's internet in Alaska, or my parents' internet in Alaska, I think he said it was 30 down and 4 or 3 up. I mean, it's absurd. You get faster internet on a Nokia brick phone. It's insane. So there's no way I could upload an episode of a podcast onto the interwebs using their internet. So because of that, I've been kind of putting this episode off until I came to my sister's house, and I got to my sister's house yesterday and just didn't have any time to record this episode because I knew that even if I recorded this episode last week or 3 or 4 days ago, that it wouldn't even upload till I got here. So now that I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and upload this episode of the podcast. I will say I'm a little bit behind on reading. This was a little bit of a slower read, like I said. Next week's book is Catch-22, which I'm actually really excited for and kind of hoping that it's a little bit more engaging. It is a longer book. I want to say that it was 20 hours on Goodreads or on Audible. It's like 600 and something pages. So, all that to say, the next episode of the podcast is also going to be late. Don't look for it on Wednesday. It's going to come out sometime before the following episode. It'll come out before 2 weeks episode because by then I'll be home and I'll be back to my normal schedule. You can know that episodes of the podcast come out at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time on Wednesday. Not next week, but the week after. We will be back on schedule. But while I'm on vacation, we're just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, which my wife absolutely hates. She's a planner. And so this whole thing has been a little bit stressful. So we're just trying to not take it too seriously. So just look out for the next episode. It should come out sometime in the next week and a half. And hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Let me know what you thought about kind of the shorter episodes. Also, let me know what you thought about a little bit of personal stories at the very beginning of the episodes. I kind of want to keep track of some of the things that my kiddos do because they're absolutely hilarious. And I think, if I have them recorded in podcast episodes, then, maybe one day it's almost like a digital diary a little bit of my reading. But I also kind of want to start including things about my kids and my wife and what happens to us in life because it'll be recorded and stored. And I am terrible at writing in a journal. And I really only have one big life-changing skill to add to my life a year. And this year it was reading. And so I'm pretty good for the next 5 years. Maybe 5 years from now, I'll pick up journaling. But for right now, it's just reading. So, yeah. let me know what you think about adding those kinds of moments into the podcast. If you like them, if you don't, I'll record them somewhere else. But if you like them, I'll keep telling stories about my kids, and hopefully they'll get funnier and funnier. And hopefully I'll just start writing more and more of these experiences down. So thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Like I said, keep an eye out for next week's episode with Catch 22. Thank you for listening, and have a good rest of your day. And lastly, hopefully I'll try next week to show some pictures of my fish. Hopefully we're going to catch some monster fish here in Alaska over the next week. So I'll put some pictures in next week's episode of the podcast. So if you usually just listen to the podcast, next week might be a week to tune in on YouTube so that you can see some of the fish that we catch. We're going halibut fishing. We're going, salmon fishing. We're gonna have a lot of fun this week. So keep tuned or stay tuned. Stay classy, San Francisco, San Diego. Oh my gosh, stay classy. Sorry, I cannot even think. I've got to end this. Thank you for listening. I am surprised I'm not dead. See you next time from the Human Juice Box and the Bookly Podcast. Later.